So, good afternoon and welcome everyone. We'll begin now. The session was delayed a bit. Um, this is about a very major and important book by the author on my right, Pratinav Anil, and the book is called Another India, The Making of World's Largest Muslim Minority, 1947 to 1977. The book is here, and indeed a major contribution because it kind of challenges the way we understand India and Indian Muslims and the historical and the contemporary dilemmas. And we'll talk about that. I do want to say that, we'll have about half an hour for Q&A. I just want to set it out so, have your questions ready. We don't want it to turn into an India bashing match or sport here, because we want to understand what has happened in the past and what is happening currently. I have Pratinav is a historian of post-colonial India. He teaches at St. Edmund Hall at Oxford. And of course, he's done lots of papers and writings. 2 books are here. And on my left is Laurence Gautier, who is the head researcher in history, politics, and society at CSH, France. She holds a PhD in history from Cambridge, and she has done many things, and you'll find out when she speaks. I shall keep it very brief. The format is that I will request Laurence to introduce the book, speak for a few minutes about the book and how she looks at it, and then we shall follow it up with Q&A with Pratinav, and then we'll open it up for you regarding the thorny issue of minorities and majoritarianism in India and by extension Pakistan.
Thank you, Raza, for your introduction, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me. It's a great honor to be here in Lahore. It's my first time in Pakistan. I live in Delhi, so this is a very exciting... It's my first time in Lahore, so it's a very exciting opportunity for me. So I'll just quickly present the book and ask some questions to Pratinav, and then we will, have a few questions and answers, and then, of course, we'll open the floor to questions. Let me tell you more about the book. So the book is very ambitious in its scope because it brings, I think it's probably one of the first books to really bring the experience of Indian Muslims after independence and over 3 decades under a single focus. We've had in India an expanding literature on the marginalization of Indian Muslims after partition. These works have highlighted the long-term impacts of partition. They've looked at also the ambivalences of the Congress Party that officially promoted the idea of unity and diversity, but in many ways was marred by majoritarian biases regarding Muslims. But as I said, the particularity of the book is that it really brings these experiences of marginalization under single focus over 3 decades. And it brings together a wide range of Muslim politics. So Pratinav has a section, one part of the book is dedicated to nationalist Muslims who worked from within the Congress Party. And then the second major section is dedicated to those who worked in the opposition, whom he refers to as communalists. And maybe, you can come back to these 2 terms that you use, nationalists and communalists, because of course the so-called opposition between nationalists and communalists has structured much of the discourse on Indian politics, but these are categories that, of course, need to be also questioned to some extent. The other characteristic of the book, before I go into the argument itself, is that it really tries to expand the focus, normally in terms of regional focus. Normally, much of the literature dedicated to Indian Muslims after independence focuses on North India for understandable reasons, because, of course, both it's the heartland of Indian politics in many ways. It was also the heartland of the Muslim League, and as a result, it has a special importance in that history. But you also bring in other parts of the country, Kerala, Assam, and Kashmir to some extent. And third point I wanted to highlight here is that you really put emphasis on the agency of these Muslim political elites. in that sense, you really try to go beyond discourse that focuses on Muslim victimhood to look at the different kinds of strategies that were adopted by the Muslim political elites after independence. Now, what is the argument? As Raza was saying, the main the main thrust of the book really is to question the idea that the Nehruvian Congress and, Congress just after Nehru protected Muslim minorities to promote an inclusive conception of the Indian nation defined by the famous idea of unity in diversity. And so you argue instead that actually minority rights were neglected from the start, from independence itself, and that Indian Muslims in many cases had to contend with discrimination, dispossession, and also an unresponsive leadership. When over a period of time, especially from the 70s onwards, the Indian Congress eventually started paying more attention to Indian Muslims' demands. Generally, so you argue that they were not so much guided by Nehruvian benevolence, but more by the fear that the Congress may lose the support of Muslim voters at a time when the party was facing an increasing political competition. And here you use the expression green scare. Maybe you will want to come back to this expression. And so here, when you speak of the fear of losing Muslim support, of course, this evokes the whole arguments around the Muslim vote bank, politics of minority appeasement. So maybe that's another another theme that you may want to come back to, because these are very important notions in today's political debates in India. The second major aspect of your argument is that the Muslim political elites themselves had a role to play in this marginalization, in this political marginalization, in the sense that especially Muslim Congress leaders like Maulana Azad, for instance, but others too, encouraged the depoliticization of the Muslim minority after independence to focus instead on cultural issues such as the protection of Urdu, or religious matters such as the Muslim personal law. And you suggest that Muslim elites often acted as an obstacle, in fact, to mass mobilization and collective solidarity to defend Muslims' rights in the face of neglect and discrimination. And one of the key expressions of your book is that of Ashraf betrayal. So you argue that these elite Muslims, so who belong to the Ashraf elites, continued to defend class-based interests, paying eventually little attention to commoners who endured great violence and discrimination. And in your conclusion, you draw a connection, that's something that you hint at very briefly, but I want to still mention it. You draw a connection between this history of suppression of dissent and this history of violence against the Muslim minority during independence and the emergency. And so and of course, we all know that your first book was actually devoted to the study of the emergency. So it's interesting that the two books come one after the other, because basically your argument is to say that the emergency did not come out of nowhere. It was not an anomaly. In a way, there is a continuity that you're tracing between this history of suppression of dissent in the early decades of independence and the emergency itself. Now, I hope that I have, presented your argument faithfully and that this is fine, but I have a few questions to ask. I will start with one, and I think Raza will also ask a question, and then we can have more questions. It so happens that I'm also very much interested in the Nehruvian period, and my question to you is, are you not pushing your case a bit too much to reverse the image of Nehru secularism? Because when we read your book, it can give the feeling that really this whole discourse on secularism and on composite culture, another notion that was very key to Nehru's discourse, was just a facade, really. And do you not tend to somehow neglect the larger context? By larger context, I have two elements in mind. One is, the impact, the trauma, we could say, of partition and this fear that the nation state, which was just coming out of independence, might very well implode. So this might partly explain this obsession that you see with Nehru and with his allies for unity, and maybe that partly explains, it doesn't justify, but it partly explains why they were crushing down dissent, because there was such fear of implosion that they had this obsession for unity. The other element of context I have in mind is the internal differences within the Congress itself. We know very well that Nehru was not all-powerful at all in the Congress. He had to deal with many factions, with people, including at the top level of the party, who had a very different conception of the Indian nation. Of course, we often think of Patel, but Patel was not alone. And so, in a way, are you not putting a bit, what would you have to say? How does this taking into consideration of the internal differences within the Congress maybe allow us to qualify a bit this picture that you present on the politics of Congress vis-a-vis the Indian Muslims?
Great, that's a good set of questions for you.
So, well, I think you quite succinctly summarized my book far better than I possibly could, because, it's been 2 years since I wrote it, and, well... It's not working, is it? Right, so as I was saying, use your lungs. As I was saying, the Nehruvian settlement wasn't such a bad thing after all, Of course, the polemical thrust of my book is against the Congress and the kind of regime that came, especially from the 60s and 70s on. Nehru himself, I think, had some fantastic ideas. Secularism was the right note, which was from the 1950s and 60s. Only, as you pointed out, it wasn't exactly a dictatorship. He was dependent on so many other people, many of whom just happened to be internationalists in the traditional sense. And that's where things took a really dark turn. So, in fact, it's as early as 1948, you have genocide against Muslims in Hyderabad, 40,000 of them killed. And, Nehru isn't exactly a hero in the story, because you have the NayaDaur report that follows investigating these crimes. And he simply buries it, and his daughter does the same when the report resurfaces in the 1970s. Suppose these instances can be multiplied in other states, as I showed in the book, and Nehru had a pretty sordid record when dealing with Muslims in Uttar Pradesh, when 90% of them were fired from the civil service in Kashmir. Well, again in Hyderabad, so both Kashmir and Hyderabad see the biggest Muslim leaders of these two states locked up very quickly after independence. And they stay there for a whole decade in the case of Hyderabad, 25 years in the case of Kashmir. So, and it's not just a question of high politics, you can come down to the level of MPs. So, the number of Muslim MPs in India was at its all-time low in the Nehruvian period, and it only became lower in Modi's India. So you see, the two regimes are often thought to be quite dissimilar, but, well, when you get down to seeing how the Muslim predicament was in the 1950s, they weren't all that different.
Yeah.
So just to come back to the point about Nehru, great man, except, well, this wasn't a period of great man history,
Yes. Yeah, I just want to actually add that Laurence Gautier's her own book is forthcoming. It's called The Nation, Between the Nation and the Community. And it's about the Aligarh Muslim University and Jamia Millia, the two centers which are associated with Indian Muslims. I wanted to say that on the record, and that's also why she's here to sort of contribute to this book launch. But I think before I only have one brief question. But before that, I finished reading it last night. It was speed reading and forced reading because of this ThinkFest. But I thoroughly enjoyed it. It's an eye-opening account because it actually demolishes the mythology that prevails in Pakistani imagination that somehow the Indian National Congress and the founding fathers of India had a different vision for Indian Muslim community. Because as it turns out, in the making of modern Indian nation, the way Indian National Congress and its key leaders in the 40s and 50s and thereafter were actually following a lot of the policies that are now coming to sort of, light, and Modi and BJP are being vilified throughout. The foundations of Modi's India is much, much deeper and an older project. I think I just wanted to state that on the record, and that's a great contribution, I think, both intellectual and in terms of popular understanding of contemporary South Asia, because the majoritarianism in Pakistan and majoritarianism in India are the two forces that we as people are dealing with and trying to make sense of it in everyday thing. My quick question to you is that, as Laurence mentioned about the different factions within the Indian National Congress when India was created, and thereafter how it proceeded. So what I do understand from your book is that, Nehru was unable to resolve that in particular, and he went along with the notion of sort of subsuming Muslim politics, Muslim identity into the larger Indian national project. Is that a valid observation of mine?
Right, I think that's completely true. Modi doesn't come out of nowhere. Internationalism has always been a rather strong current in India, going back to the 1920s, in fact. And in fact, the 1950s are a period where Hindu nationalism really comes into its own. And of course, electorally, they become a much bigger force only in the 1970s, but many of the themes are already there in the 1950s. So I suppose you might be familiar with the disenfranchisement of Indian Muslims in Assam and Northeast India. So this is a story that actually begins in the 1950s. And well, you can look at Home Ministry papers in Delhi, and they'll tell you pretty much the same thing. Something like 100,000 Muslims were kicked out of India in the Nehruvian period. Nehru ruled from 1947 to 1964. These halcyon days of Indian secularism, where there was so much distrust against Muslims that they were quite literally being kicked out to, well, what was then Pakistan. So
yes.
As you can see, there's a rather long history out here, and that's something I reconstructed in the pages of this book.
Okay, Laurence.
Thank you. So I just wanted to ask you two more questions. One is related to this notion of Ashraf betrayal. So I think it's very useful to use this notion in a way which also allows us to see the differences among Indian Muslims, that were, so of course there's no way that Indian Muslims formed a homogeneous community. There were many differences based on regional belonging and of course caste and class. At the same time, when you speak of Ashraf betrayal, it can give the feeling that, Ashraf elites actually, were able to navigate the troubled waters, as you said, and, got away with it very easily, while they abandoned more ordinary Muslims. But at the same time, your book shows clearly that they actually lacked leverage. I mean, you have done excellent portraits of some key Muslim politicians. So I'm thinking in particular of Sayyid Mahmood, Humayun Kabir, and Sadullah. And these are very useful portraits because actually they allow you to develop a more nuanced and qualified argument about how some politicians did try to do something to defend Muslims' rights, sometimes to ask for reservations, for instance. But at the end, they didn't get much. Now, don't you think that here, it's not just a betrayal from the Ashraf, it's also the fact that even if they belong to the upper class, upper caste, they still were part of the minority, and as such, they didn't have that much leverage at the end of the day. So class interests only trumped the confessional card to some extent, but not completely. That's my first question. Can I ask a second question?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
My second question is what about non-elite politics? Because while your book is extremely ambitious on its scope, it is true that it's more focused on elite Muslim politicians, and fair enough. I mean, your book is ambitious enough already, but if you were to extend your argument and try to include non-elite politics, how would you connect, non-elite Muslim politics with, Ashraf politics? For example, there's recent work that has been done which is generally region-based, which shows that already in the 1950s and 60s you have new forms of Muslim politics emerging, usually revolving around mohallas or masjids or basically around local figures and local Muslim sites. How would you connect these two different forms of politics? Yes.
Right.
Right, so, well, for me, the Ashraf betrayal was just a shorthand to talk about class, and I really think when we're dealing with South Asia, and this is not just India, class counts for a lot more than religion, and that's insufficiently recognized, and I don't say this just because I'm a Marxist, but, well, that may have something to do with that. But the broader point I'm trying to make here is that Muslims in India landed on their feet quite well, so long as they happen to be the right kind of Muslim, which is to say, Muslims of a certain class and a certain background. So especially the landed elites did fairly well, and the Muslim middle classes too. I have a whole chapter on the waqfs, the Muslim endowments of the 60s and 70s, and I show how they were insulated from taxation, and they managed to preserve their properties, and things moved in a rather swimming fashion for them. And this was an entirely different case when we're dealing with subaltern Muslims who accounted for, well, the millions who died in riots from the 1950s on. Well, the Muslim petty bourgeoisie whose shops were burnt in these riots and they never quite recovered, or the Muslim working classes who were turfed out of factories. Some of the big status projects, you know, the big steel plants which employed 50 to 100,000 people, you know. One sees barely a tiny 1 or 2% Muslim presence in them. And all of this goes down to show that actually class is a real cleavage here rather than religion. So that's the Ashraf betrayal. And you're quite right to emphasize that mass politics was, you know, in an incipient fledgling state in the 1950s. And had I dealt with the 1980s and 90s, there would be a lot more of that, because that's when Pasmanda Muslim politics comes into its own in places like Bihar, and then you have figures like Saeed Shahabuddin who mobilize Muslims around the Babri Masjid. But broadly, I want to say Muslims emphasized culture to the detriment of politics, which is to say they're obsessed with things like Muslim personal law. And this, in fact, alienated them even more from the Hindu majority. And this drove a deeper religious wedge within Indian society. So rather than trying to focus on questions of class, they spoke more about protecting the ulama. Well, what does Muslim personal law mean in India? Well, in the 50s and 60s, it meant sanction for polygamy, for triple talaq. You know, none of these bespeak progressivism in any manner. And it's easy to see how that alienates Hindus, and it creates the sentiment that a minority was being corseted by the Nehruvian establishment. So, of course, this is a narrative, and I don't necessarily subscribe to it, but my basic point is if Muslims have been focusing more on class and building solidarities with Dalits and the other backward classes, they would have been more successful at delivering a sustained attack on Hindu nationalism.
So, which also, I mean, I do want to raise this question because your book ends at 1977. Now, obviously, BJP's rise comes later in the 80s and 90s. So how, I mean, how do you view what is happening currently? I mean, of course, one, quick observation is that it's a continuation of the state policy, right, from the start. Do you think that BJP's policies, and particularly Modi and his associates and their politics, has it taken it too far, or is it just the norm continuing?
Well, the real trouble with the BJP is that it is so dispiritingly successful in a way that the Hindu nationalists never were in the 1950s. You know, they have a party apparatus of something like 200 million Hindus, and they have the people in the judiciary, in the armed forces, and well, in the press, and practically everywhere. So Of course, the 2024 election is something of a foregone conclusion. We're probably going to see Modi's vote share increase even further. Uh, Reversing the traditional expectance. Well, we normally expect anti-incumbency in the Indian setting. That's just how democracies are supposed to work. You get tired of your leaders and you boot them out. Not so with Modi. I mean, he's just moving from strength to strength. So in a way, Hindu nationalism is much stronger today than it ever was under Nehru or any of his successors. So I suppose I'm not making a very radically controversial prediction when I say things are going to be a lot worse for Muslims in the 21st century than they were in the second half of the 20th.
Yeah, so thank you. And I have another question, which is an age. So actually, this question was raised by Mr. Najam Sethi, who's here, a decade ago. He asked, one of an Indian, dyed-in-wool nationalist was visiting, and he asked them about leadership question. He said, who is the leader of Muslims? And you touch upon this issue as well. You talk about Azad, how he was sidelined, how Azad actually gave up. And then you talk about other characters, from the three categories of the communalists, the nationalists, and the notables. And so who is currently leads the Muslims? I mean, of course, they are diverse as India is, but I mean, is that a factor that contributes to the lack of agency within the Muslim communities to sort of resist or build solidarities or create the kind of politics that would safeguard their political and civil rights? Sorry for,
Right.
I know it's not.
Well,
limited to your book
you're
stuff.
quite right to emphasize the lack of a collective Muslim leadership across the country. And I'm not entirely sure that would be a positive development if a figure like that were to emerge at some point. Of course, you have regional figures like Owaisi in Hyderabad, and you can see why he repelled so many people. He comes from a party that holds deeply Islamist views. So if you look at some of the election manifestos of the 1960s and 70s of the AIMIM, they were anti-miscegenation. They tried to prevent, they broke up Muslim marriages with Muslim Hindu marriages. So in a way, they're not too different from the BJP. So that's not the kind of politics that will boot out Hindu nationalism in India. So when we say we need Muslim leaders in India, what we really mean is we need leaders that can corral all manner of subalterns together in a broader coalition. So they need not be Muslims themselves, but they need to represent Muslims. And if they are Muslims, they should be able to represent Dalits as well. So it's a way, that's just how democracies work, that's first past the post, it's the tyranny of the majority. So if you have to win people over, you have to bring all manner of minorities together. There's no way you can just represent one and expect, a greater share of the political power.
Thank you. And I think we can open it up for Q&A. But before we do that, we have a very eminent Indian editor and public intellectual, Siddharth Rajan. And I think I would like you to comment very briefly on this particular problematic that we are trying to grapple with, because Siddharth's work at the moment is, the Wire that he edits and he's founded is one of the leading voices in India in terms of arguing for and protecting the minority rights. So maybe a quick comment by you, Siddharth, on this debate from the right, from the foundations of Indian modern nation state to the current day. And sadly, the mics is not working, so you'll have to yell.
Must confess, I haven't read the book, but going back what I've heard about it, and it seems to me work of this kind in the scholarly terrain is long overdue. As a journalist, we have always confronted the reality, and I'm saying, forget about 47 to 77. Just look at even the period from the 80s onwards. And it's very clear that Narendra Modi, even though the RSS has a history going back to 1925, fact is that there's been a long arc of political and institutional practice that has paved the way for many of the things that we're seeing today. Of course, the degree is much more acute, and but the fact is that the terrain of othering Muslims, discrimination, this has been a fact of life from from the time of independence, and you can see that in the systematic elimination of Urdu, which I think your book talks about. But as a language that was very widely spoken and was an important element of education, and here the way in which many of the North Indian states actually devised or decided to implement the language formula for education to essentially eliminate Urdu and introduce in its place Sanskrit, and then how that feeds into, again, a certain sense of what is Indian and what's not.
Yeah.
And many of the historical disputes that we are confronting today, Babri Masjid, for example, has its origins in the modern period, 92, an episode in 48-49, when the Congress government of United Province of UP and at the center capitulated in the face of an illegal act, where a mosque was broken into, idols were placed, and then in typical Indian fashion of compromise, they say, okay, just lock it up and hope the problem goes away, because problems don't go away. And the other thing I would like to flag, just again by way of that long arc of historical continuity, is the fact that India is perhaps the only modern democracy to have a law that seeks to regulate religious conversion. I can understand, and we need to pay attention to what that tells you about the instincts of the state, because I can see why you want a law to outlaw coercion of any kind. Nobody should be forced to support Manchester United, right? And so, sure, you can have a law to say if somebody is forced to support Manchester United, then they, then they can be prosecuted, or the person doing that can. Why is it that the religion of the person, like of all the affinities that an individual has in her life, right? Sporting is trivial, but let's say politics, right? When a person decides in India to defect when a sitting legislator decides to leave the Congress party and join Bharatiya Janata Party, or vice versa, there is no process of law that is kicked in to see whether that shift happened because of some illegal inducement or coercion, right? So the political affiliation is somehow something that's not, that's left to your free choice. But your choice of religion is somehow seen as very dangerous, right? In a very, and these were Congress governments in the 60s, mainly worried about Christian missionaries and so on, that then grandfather a lot of this. So a lot of the laws things that you see taking a very pernicious legal form today, like the Citizenship Amendment Act, or these so-called love jihad laws, you can trace their origin to the fact that the state itself began interfering in domains where it had no business to be.
Correct.
And I would say, I haven't thought deeply about Nehru's own role, or the fact that the Congress party itself, historically, and this is known, right, drew on a number of ideological traditions.
Yes.
And so secularism and socialism was only one part, but there was also a very strong, Hindutva or Hindu nationalist, ideology which informs. So I think I'm very glad that you have, if you've done this kind of serious study, because this kind of corrective. Some may argue it's come at a wrong time.
Yes.
That Modi will say, look, I'm not so bad.
Yeah, that's what I was.
But that's what the job of historians is to chronicle and not.
Yeah.
Well done.
That's what I asked him after last time. But great comment. Thank you. And before we open up, I just have to, this reminds me of a famous poem by Fahmida Riaz, late Fahmida Riaz, "Tum bilkul hum jaise dikh rahe." So what unites us among culture, history is also bigotry and majoritarianism, which we very conveniently practice here, and which is currently, we know by historical accounts, has been practiced right from the foundational times of the making of Indian state. But anyway, it's open to Q&A. If you have a comment, please keep it very brief, but we prefer questions. But I think Laurence also wants to intervene before we start.
Because we spoke of the protection of Urdu, and it's true that in the book you tend to say that Maulana Azad and other Muslim politicians after independence discarded political issues and focused on cultural issues or religious issues, and you mentioned protection of Urdu as one of them. I just want to bring to attention the fact that actually Urdu is not just about culture, it's about access to education, access to jobs. So in that sense, it's one good example of actually it's not always easy to dissociate political and cultural issues. And I think it's important to remember that in the mobilization for the protection of Urdu, you had not just elite Muslims mobilizing, but actually, especially in states like Bihar, you've had actually lower class Muslims who mobilized in very large numbers. And so that's one very good example of how actually you had some issues that bridge the gap, if I may say, albeit maybe from different standpoints between elite and non-elite Muslims. Sorry, that was a very short remark.
No, thank you, thank you. So questions and answers, yeah, okay, start.
Hi there. Thanks a lot. My question to you is if you are planning to write another India which looks at 17 onwards to the present day, and can you tell us a bit more about the Muslim experience in this 30-year period where the Kashmiri Muslims may have had a different experience? Who was worst off? So you had
across the country.
Muslims.
Class issue being true across South Asia. And then I heard your comment about Modi going from strength to strength. I recently had a very long conversation with Ashoka Modi on his book, India is Broken, where he says that given the class nature of this issue, India is not generating enough jobs for the vast majority of Indians. And India will never be able to sustain high growth because of that. So that, in a sense, sets the limit to the strength, going from strength to strength argument.
Yes, so two questions. Who was worst off if you were to do a sequel? So hierarchies of oppression. So,
Well, I doubt I'm going to write a sequel on Indian Muslims from 1977 to now, so sorry to dampen your expectations on that front. And coming to the Olympics of oppression, I don't think it's an entirely profitable exercise for one reason. Everyone is going to claim oppression on some ground or another. And, I would probably say Muslims in India's peripheries at large have had it worse than Muslims in the heartland. And that probably owes to historical circumstances. So, the Muslims in the Hindi belt, at least the ones who are well off, could migrate, and they're the Muhajirs of Pakistan today. In the peripheries, it was quite easy to demonize them, especially in Kerala, as being perhaps too influenced by Gulf capital and, this renewed piousness they come back with when they travel to the Middle East for jobs. Or in Assam, where they're seen as fifth columnists, or Kashmir, of course, famously so. So I suppose, this is more of a heartland periphery question of and coming to the question of jobs, I don't think Modi's success owes in any measure to his economic record to begin with, because if that was the case, he would have gone down in defeat in 2019 after demonetization. So I really think his success owes to ideology, just Hindu nationalism as such, which has gained so much currency in the last 10 years. Yes, because India's growth rate was negative very briefly after demonetization, and the cack-handed response to the pandemic gave you another indication of what a terrible administrator Modi is. But that hasn't done the least to dent his support. So I think, of course, India has chronic underemployment, which is in a way much worse than unemployment, which is always in the 7 to 10% range, which doesn't quite capture the essence of how bad things are. And India's middle class are shrinking, and they're really tiny, 84 million at last count. Well, probably more Germans who are middle class than Indian at this point. So all of which is to say, his economic handling can go from bad to worse, but none of that will register electorally, in my opinion.
Okay, so I'm being told that we have to stop, so we'll just take one, yeah, two questions, and then we'll conclude. Okay, first you,
Right.
okay, loud.
This is when I teach history at Government College University. My question is that the idea that how a national culture should not culminate into a majoritarian nationalism was quite
Mm-hmm.
popular in 1940s when different partitions were happening, when different decolonizations were happening. So in that context, Nehru somehow tried to adopt that idea, and the different Muslim literati or the Muslim ashraf also tried to somehow work with that. Obviously, it had its limit in Bihar and Assam, as you said. Um, but what I really want to know what else they could have done. For example, while being in Delhi, Azad is trying to resettle the Muslims, but he's facing a lot of issues and all those other things. So, once partition has begun, once you have created this land, if you read Tulukul and Haider and all those other Muslim, literati, what could more they have done? At that time, it was a very revolutionary idea. If you speak it right now, it might turn to be a conservative majoritarian idea, but at that time, it was a very radical idea.
What are we talking about? Decolonization, is it?
So I'm saying that what else the Muslim, Ashraf could have done to
After
somehow, yeah,
independence.
after the independence, to somehow curtail this marginalization, or just
Yeah.
prevent the
So
Right.
thank you, Mer. So let's take Tamkinat's question.
Right.
Okay. No, I'm saying we'll club them. Okay, okay, okay.
So I can give you one example, from the Constituent Assembly debates. So this is where you saw cultural safeguards taking precedence over political safeguards. So India was supposed to have separate electorates going forward in 1949, and Azad was very happy to give up on that, and as were most of the other Ashraf. So that would have guaranteed some level of representation in India. So then they decided to settle on reservations, and as you know, Dalits, that is, the former untouchables, who happened to be Hindu, managed to get reservations in 1949. But Muslims did not, despite being poorer in economic terms. And again, that's because the Ashraf decided this wasn't a battle worth fighting for in 1949. But where they did put their foot down was to defend Muslim personal law, because this is what really mattered to them. And what did it exactly matter? Unequal inheritance for women, well, triple talaq. And as I've mentioned, these things did not really benefit the Muslim community of India at large. But this is what they fought for, and this is what they achieved in the Indian Constitution. So this is a clear example of sacrificing the political for the cultural. And that could have been a radically different outcome if the Ashraf was not dominated by the clerical classes. What's common to figures like Maulana Azad and so many others were, well, they were Maulana, as it were. They were clerical people, and naturally they had a penchant for religious safeguards rather than political ones.
Right. So we are out of time, but we have one pending question from Tamkinat because she's my friend. So I'll do some good old
Right.
South Asian nepotism. So please.
What do you think are the differences and similarities? How
Right, so I think Dalit politics began in a rather terrible fashion in the 1950s. Ambedkar himself was unseated from parliament. His political party went nowhere. He pretended that he could, he let on that he was representing Dalits across the country, but he never managed to extend his support base beyond the Mahars, the small group of Dalits he belonged to in what was then Bombay province and a bit in the United Provinces, what became Uttar Pradesh. But by the late 60s and early 70s, Dalit politics comes into its own. And, you even have radical movements like the Dalit Panthers. And by the 80s and 90s, Dalit parties are practically the second and third largest parties in Uttar Pradesh and beyond. So you see, it's an upward trajectory, and it's the rise of the subalterns. But you see no commensurate development for the Muslims. And much the same thing can be said about the OBCs. By 1989 and 1990, they get reservations, but Muslims still don't have it. Right.
They still don't have it. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yes, thank you so much.